This is a Hope 1032 podcast.
Hello, welcome to Undistracted. I'm your host, Laura Bennett, and this is the podcast where we learn from our guests how to be better at building our lives with intention around our passions, our purpose, and deal with some of the stuff that gets in the way of that. Stress definitely can hold us back in life. Our guest today is Dr. Nick Hall. He's a neuroscientist and expert on stress and its effect on the body, our health, our well-being. He's helped out the FBI, athletes, high-level companies work out their relationship to stress, and he's written about it in his book, The Stress Recovery Effect. Today he's here with us. Let's welcome Dr. Nick to the show. What do you view stress as being now?
You know, that was a question that a group of us tried to resolve years ago in Brussels, in Belgium. A meeting that had been convened by Roger Guillemin, Nobel laureate, and hosted by King Leopold, actually. And at that time, European scientists wanted to get into this area of stress. Which was already taking off in America, especially the way that it affected health performance. And so the first thing was the question you asked: how do we define stress? What exactly is it? And I'll just get to the bottom line. It's essentially everything, including the kitchen sink. Physicists defined it as the strain, the stress on a bridge abutment, for example, an airplane wing. The psychiatrists spoke in terms of depression, anxiety, the behaviors associated with stress-induced emotions. The biologists, endocrinologists like me, were speaking in terms of the hormones, the autonomic nervous system, the fight-flight response, and fueled by adrenaline, noradrenaline. And so there really is no one definition that satisfies everyone who uses the term. And that's just for biologists. I haven't even gotten into the poets, suppose, in literature, who talk about emotions and stress. So in answer to your question, it comes down to the individual. Now, if there's something that's interfering with their ability to accomplish their goal or to succeed, then to them, it's their stressor. That may not be the case for somebody else who thrives on what they're experiencing.
So perhaps it's more the effect of stress that's a little more universal, that sense of pressure that we may feel or the sense of being stretched. Could we define it by its effect instead?
I think maybe approaching it from the standpoint of what can result in the stress. When a person feels they are out of control, there's nothing they can do. When they cannot predict when this incident or circumstance is going to end, and they have no sense of optimism that things are going to get better. And so whatever would fit into that would constitute their stressor.
And what for you was the thing that made you so interested in studying stress and in studying its effect on our brains?
Well, I could give you the sort of proper answer, and then I'll tell you the real answer. The proper answer, I suppose, is when I went to university, I majored in psychology, experimental psychology. I'd spent 2 years doing research with the US Office of Naval Research, training whales and dolphins as part of a stress-related communication study. We would find these magnificent animals, whales, dolphins, washed up on beaches, having committed what seems to be mass suicide. It really isn't. With the beach strandings, I know you've had a lot of those in Australia. They occur throughout the world. And when I became interested in the brain, we would do autopsies on these animals and find all sorts of things in the brain that were similar to humans, including diseases. And that piqued an interest in studying the brain. Went on, got a degree in neuroscience, and then became interested in how it all affected health, the immune system, and so went on to do research in what conveniently was called psychoneuroimmunology. I had all the proper bits and pieces. I suppose the slant towards stress, which I've always been interested in, was a summer job I had in the 1960s when I was a teenager, wrestling alligators and milking rattlesnakes.
What a combination.
Right. The animals, I realized, were just as stressed as I was when I first started doing it. A rattlesnake's tail shaking is the equivalent of a person's hand trembling with fear. And once I realized that they were more afraid of me than I was of them, as it turned out, that's how it all came about. Now, the story is I've never really had a plan in my life. I've always flitted from one opportunity to another. And it's just the way all the pieces fell into place.
Interestingly, though, not having a plan, that's something that could be a real cause of stress for so many people. For you, do you find it motivating to instead be able to follow your curiosity and not have some kind of plan then?
Absolutely. I would not live my life any other way, which I would know would drive some people crazy. And I think the reason is because I was encouraged to do this as a young child. My mother survived the Blitz in London during World War II. She was 18, 19 years old, and she volunteered to remain in London, even though lots of young women, their children, were being sent over to Ireland to protect them. She was needed in her job, and so remained. And she spoke of seeing the empty desks the next morning, knowing those people hadn't survived the night. Heard stories of loss, the relatives of mine who never came back from Europe. And so my mother's philosophy became live life to the hilt, because you may not be here tomorrow. And so when I was 14 years old, living in Massachusetts, where they had very strict child labor laws, which they didn't in South Dakota, still rather like the Old West. And there was the opportunity to get a job at a tourist attraction. And it was 2,000 miles away. She had no problem with my getting on a Greyhound bus, going cross country for a couple of days, spending the entire summer out there, came back at the end of the summer when the tourist season was over, and went on to school. My initial job was sweeping floors and cleaning toilets, probably more appropriate for my abilities then. And then eventually people got bitten by alligators and rattlesnakes. That was part of the job, really. And so they needed replacements. And eventually, when I was 17, I was next in line, and that's what I ended up doing.
Yeah, and I guess you just fingers crossed you don't lose too many body parts in the process.
Right. So, and I got bitten by both rattlesnakes and alligators. And so I think it was her philosophy. And so I really had no fear. That we had a wonderful relationship, very loving family. And so it was not a desire to leave. But at the same time, she had always, at a very young age, given me permission to explore. Let's count of the number of times I was dragged home by the police in Woodbridge in Suffolk, England. Not for any major crime, but just, out wandering by myself and getting up to mischief, things that, 5, 6-year-olds do. And so she would say, "Oh, can you keep him at police station for a while? I'll get away from the shop until 5 o'clock." So there was no punishment for going out and having a little adventure.
Yeah, and to think that, at 5 or 6, you're off having these adventures. So often I feel like we hear stories of a childhood that was very different from the ones that so many are growing up in now. Even the characteristics of your mum to just have gone through so much and then, encourage you to spread your wings in that way. In the stress recovery book, you do touch on the fact that it's almost like this is a generalization, but a lot of the younger generation who haven't faced as much hardship, who haven't lived through turmoil sort of face to face in the same way that so many generations have gone before us, there is a resilience element that may be missing. Yes, there's hardship in the world. Yes, there's many conflicts, but particularly for those of us that live in America, that live in Australia, that live in these parts of the world, we're not faced with it in the same way. What would you say to that? The need for, I suppose, a level of resilience to be developed. How do we build resilience when we're not living through the same sorts of things?
I think that's probably a question that really needs to be asked of, or if the instruction needs to be given to a 6-month-old, because that's where it begins. One of the major stressors that we all experience is when we are thrust into the world after living in a temperature and humidity controlled environment for 9 months, round the clock room service. You don't even have to ring a bell to get nourishment, needs met. And then suddenly you're hurtled into a strange world, bright lights, people in strange uniforms. You're dangled upside down, slapped on the backside. You scream out in terror. That's the first stressor. And it is really essential because that's what helps to inflate the lungs, breathing rapidly during that crying. It's what activates the heart, which is non-functional until we're born, till that moment. It's disconnected from the lungs. And so it's not until that moment that the hole that connects the left and the right ventricle closes, enabling blood to go up into the lungs. So life really begins with a major stressor. It's essential. And then, of course, around 6 months, we realize that we're different from our mothers. We're essentially tied to them. But then we have to venture out a little bit. There's a dad in the room too, and he looks different. He's a little bit different. So I've got to leave mom and go to him. And then, of course, we start going off and play playgrounds with other children. We go off to school. And there's a conflict because we have to leave the security of being with our parents, being in a home. And so leaving that is a bit of a stressor, it's a conflict. And at the same time, we don't really know what's going to happen when we go to that new environment, the school, for example. And so we're sort of torn. We've got this, we want to stay here, but we want to go there. A parent who has encouraged her children to go off and doesn't feel that I have to be overly protective is going to basically give the child permission to take chances. And they're going to learn the natural consequences of making the wrong choice. They realize if they touch something sharp, like a knife, it's going to bleed and it's going to hurt. It's not going to kill them, but it's going to be something that they will remember. And they learn not to walk up to a strange dog. They might get bitten. So they learn these lessons, that there are consequences. And this is even before their prefrontal lobes are fully formed, which enables us to associate future punishment and reward with what we do now. But it begins at a very, very early age.
How do we then introduce stress into our lives in a positive way? Because there is a distinction between stress that's negative for us and stress that can be an ally, as you've described it. So what are the positive ways to bring stress into our lives?
Probably exercise. And I would add to that, exercise outdoors. And exercise, and I'll come back to why outdoors and not indoors in a moment. Exercise brings on a lot of the biological changes associated with the types of things we experience in everyday life, interpersonal conflict, a lousy reward system at work, all of those things we associate with the world. However, you're in control. You can stop the exercise whenever you want. You can rev it up when you want. Your heart rate goes up in the same manner that it does when you lose your job, when you lose a loved one. Your breathing goes up. There's the release of the same stress hormones that are providing energy to sustain the exercise that would be activated to sustain your fight-flight response. And it all requires energy. And so I think exercise is a wonderful way to train your body, not so much to increase your strength, your coordination, the skill that you're trying to perfect, but rather to recover. You've got to do it the right way. It's why I love a bicycle. You need to, when you exercise, if you go out for half an hour, you go to the gym, you work out on a bicycle ergometer for 30 minutes. You go for a walk for an hour. When you get back, you stop. You've had 30 minutes, an hour of stress. You get one lousy recovery period at the end when you stop. So the way to do it really and it doesn't matter, just pick something you enjoy doing it with somebody else perhaps, is you want intervals of pushing yourself and then recovering. And what that does is provide you with multiple recovery periods during the exercise. And so I think that's a very good way to start. Now, it doesn't have the emotional component, which is critical. You're in control. You know you're going to finish in half an hour. You're not putting yourself in a position of no control, no predictability, which induces fear.
Can we
But you
train
will-
ourselves to deal with emotional stress?
Yes, we can. And that is by putting yourself into situations where you experience the emotion. A lot of people have a fear of public speaking. So go to a school meeting, go to a city council meeting, and sign up to say a few words.
So, what in the line of work that you've been able to work with some pretty incredible organisations, notably the FBI, helping those in that kind of field. What is it that we can learn from what you taught FBI investigators about how to deal with stress?
Well, nothing really that is specific to their occupation, because their stressors are very different. If they're going on a dangerous fugitive task force and they have to remain awake for 24, 30 hours doing surveillance, and there's constant danger, that's not the things they do are not exactly the same. But I think what's important when people hear about these people, combat veterans who've been through battles, fighter pilots who've had dicey landings on aircraft carriers, is, it doesn't matter what the stressor is, people can survive it. They have the skills. And it turns out that the same things we do, that they do, are what really works in general for everybody. And that is putting yourself in a position of being able to predict. Fear is what holds people back so often. Fear of failure, perhaps fear of being hurt. And fear comes about as a result of not being able to predict. So if you are a fighter pilot, for example, you learn everything you can about the operation of that plane. One time, I actually went with the FBI to the Space Center in Houston, Texas, to interview the astronauts. Hoot Gibson was the one we met with, who was the first American astronaut to go up to the space shuttle. And we asked him, how do you decide who's going to get the keys to the shuttle? Who's going to get to drive? And I said, what do you look for? And he says, well, we look for fighter pilots who've made, I forget how many, but multiple landings at night on an aircraft carrier. He said, if you can survive that, you've got what it takes. And then he pointed to these volumes. It looked like, well, a lot of people, millennials wouldn't identify with this, but the New York telephone directory back in the 1970s, for example, I think massive. Standard operating procedures for everything. And they memorize the critical ones. Fire in the cockpit, what do you do? Any type of an emergency, a certain alarm goes off, they memorize the procedure. So in their particular case, they're now able to predict. They've done it. They've got a muscle memory for it. And so the fear is going to be less. By the time the fear comes around, it's all over. And so learning as much as possible. Anybody can do that.
Yeah, the preparation thing is very much key, and perhaps it's part of what helps us get to what you and Dick, your co-writer, describe as the optimal stress zone. Can you articulate what that is for us?
It varies from individual to individual. A marathon runner would call it in the zone. They are running and everything is falling into place. They're experiencing the endorphins, and that stimulates a feeling of well-being. We all have it, but it's going to vary depending upon the situation and the environment that they're in. Now, it was a concept that was first reported in the literature, maybe some other people had thought of it before, by two physiologists in Boston, and Yerkes and Dodson. A study done with laboratory animals. And what they found is that if the animal had a large amount of stress, they committed errors of commission. If they didn't have enough stress, errors of omission. I'll explain that in just a moment. And so in the middle was that sweet spot. Now, at the FBI Academy, I would put heart rate monitors on the agents, and then we would recreate a scenario where an agent had died in the line of duty, hire professional actors to come in and play the role of the bad guy. And even though it was all make-believe, they used ammunition fired out of real guns, but they were plastic. So they're moving around, they're listening to radio transmissions, receiving information, heat sensors to identify where the people were in the building before entering. The heart rate, maybe 10% up, higher than normal resting. They enter the building, creeping down the hall, and heart rate now is up 90 to 100 beats per minute. Probably the movement and now the anticipation. Granted, if this is not a real situation, they know it's not, but they're being judged and they want to do it right. So fear of failure, more than being hurt, is what's motivating them. Those agents whose heart rate goes up to 120, 130, and it stays there, are the ones who may fire towards the criminal without taking into account who might be on the other side in another room, on the other side of that drywall, sending a bullet through, hurting probably somebody, an innocent bystander. That's an error of commission. There are some agents whose heart rate barely moves. The action unfolds, this is all fun and games, I'm not going to take this seriously. And they're the ones who leave a gun lying on the counter, they cuff the guy in the front instead of the back. They don't notice the shadow down at the end of the hall. There's another bad guy they didn't know about back there. Those are errors of omission. The ones whose heart rate goes up to 120, 130, comes down to 110. You don't want it to come down too far, all the way. You want them to be vigilant. Those are the ones who do it by the book.
As you describe this, though, it makes me think about the fact that some people really thrive on stress, and we're making this assumption that our listeners would want to manage stress to deal with the things that are causing them anxiety. But maybe you actually find that you believe that if you didn't have stress in your life, you wouldn't be able to get as much done in as short a time, that stress allows you to be effective in some way. What would you say to that? Why is our stress something that we should be paying attention to and managing in some way?
Well, not all people need to manage it. They do fine. I exercise, but not for the purpose of training my body to deal with stress. My God, I get enough of that without doing anything. My bicycle, riding down the road, worrying if I'm going to meet up with a large lorry or truck. There are some people who work very stressful lives. A healthcare worker working in the emergency room and working constantly, probably doesn't even have time to take off for lunch. That's a very stressful occupation. But there are other people who don't have enough stress. They do the same boring routine all the time. They get very little feedback about what they're doing. For them, it's boredom. Boredom is their anxiety. For them, the equal and opposite thing that they should do to counterbalance it is when they go home, sign up for community theater. You've got to memorize lines. You're going to be standing up there on stage wondering if you're going to flub them. Or participate in some sort of sports where you're running around and experiencing tennis, pickleball, whatever. So I think it depends on the individual, and not all people need to do anything specifically to deal with stress. And I say I don't do anything specifically, but the fact is, riding a bicycle, hiking, kayaking, these are all things that automatically minor stressors, which help to keep me tuned.
Let me ask you this then. If we could be doing anything to have a better relationship with stress, then what would that advice be that you give to somebody to help us have a healthier approach or relationship to stress?
I think it's to experience as much as you can. And for real experience, there are some people who use abstractions. They get their information, they gather the information, but it's only a very small part of what's really happening. They experience things vicariously through somebody else. They watch the television and they listen to the opinions and the information being fed to them by the professional opinion generators. It's those people who actually go out and that's why I said at the beginning, whatever you do exercise-wise, do it outside. Absorb the fragrances, absorb all this visual stimuli, the auditory stimuli. You don't have to pay attention to it. It's a complete break from what you normally do. And I think just going for a walk in the evening, you don't even have to worry about getting your heart rate up. Just a change of scenery, ever so easy to do. You can do it with a friend, a family member. Make it fun. And I think that's the sort of thing people need to be thinking about. Not to mention that it'll help stimulate improved health overall.
Yeah, and the health effects are something we haven't touched on a whole lot in this conversation, but there's plenty of insights in the stress recovery effects. I'll point that out for people. And one thing I do want to touch on that you bring up in the book is the idea of having a worry space. You give us permission to worry and have some kind of, I was going to say structure, but maybe structure is a little bit, maybe not the right word, but tell us about the worry space. Why is that something that you encourage?
Some people routinely go to bed same time, often will watch the evening news, which is full of negative stuff. Somebody's been shot, bad accident, horrible weather conditions, which is not the best way to relax before going to sleep. And then their head will hit the pillow and they start worrying about what they're going to do the next day. Oh, did I finish that report properly? I forgot about this meeting. And they're lying in bed and doing the same thing that Pavlov did with his dogs, but instead of a bell, it's the pillow. It's the bedside lamp. It's everything associated with the bed and sleeping. And so it's almost as though the next night they're exhausted because they lay awake worrying the night before. And all of a sudden their head hits the pillow and they pick up where they left off the night before. So I think it's critical not to associate your favorite place with worrying. That's why I advise clients to get up and go somewhere else. Sit in that uncomfortable chair you reserve for the unwelcome guest who shows up. you want to get rid of. You let the dog sleep in it, that sort of thing. And so, you don't want to associate your favorite place with this. And I know that years ago, there were very concerned people wanting to make sure that hospitals were conducive to pleasure for children. So they'd be happy when they were in the hospital for their condition. And Disneyland, the Walt Disney Company, has sent their artists in to paint Disney things, scenes on the walls of the children's unit. Well, children didn't want to go into the Disney stores because they associated those pictures with the hospital, which no matter what the hospital does, that's not a place you go on holiday. They can make it as pleasurable as they can, but there's still the fact that it's associated with pain and discomfort. And so that's been found to happen with chemotherapy, where people often will associate the fish in the tank in the corner, the sign as they drove past into the parking lot before receiving it, actually can condition a decrease in the immune system, which is a side effect of a treatment. I mean, that's how powerful conditioning is. And it's not that difficult to condition anything that's around you, music, to the worry cycle. So do it somewhere else, and don't select a time to do it when it's not likely to interfere with your productivity or things that you want to do. And it's like eating your favorite food. If you eat it every day, for lunch, breakfast, and dinner, you're not going to like it anymore. And I think eventually, if you start these periods of worrying, you'll get it out of your system.
Well, it's a really helpful way to look at it. So thank you so much for this conversation today, Nick. Really appreciate your time and for all that you contributed to the book as well. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Laura, and I've enjoyed the session with you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Undistracted. You can read up more on Dr. Nick Hall's work in the stress recovery effect. And until next time, enjoy living this undistracted life.